This is Econ Solutions, looking at market failure in the Unit 3 topic content. So market failure is essentially when markets run poorly or not at all in the case of a missing market. So if they run poorly, the allocation of resources is just not efficient, and in the case of a missing market, the incentive function is broken down, so therefore there's no incentive to produce that product and the market will become missing. Another way markets can fail is to do with social costs, private costs, and social benefits and private benefits, which I'll talk about more later in this video. But it's essentially the idea that goods are overproduced or underproduced or overconsumed or underconsumed, and that's in relation to merit and demerit goods, which you'll also have come across in the AS content. So I think it's important to differentiate between what a public and a private good is with regards to market failure. So private goods essentially have three characteristics, as do public goods, and they're the opposite of each other. So excludability, rivalry, and rejectability, these are three characteristics of private goods. So if a good is excludable, what that means is you can stop someone from using it, so it has excludability. If it's rivaled, what that means is you using it will stop someone else from using it. So when someone uses that good, less of the benefits are available for someone else. And finally, rejectability, which isn't mentioned as much, but it's essentially the idea that with a private good, you have the option to opt out of that purchase, which is not necessarily the case with a public good. Now, public goods are essentially have the opposite of this. So they have non-excludability, non-rivalry, and non-rejectability. So these characteristics should give you an idea of why there are missing markets. Because if you think of something like national defence, if you cannot exclude anyone from gaining the benefits of that. If you're protecting your borders, and some people buy into that, and some people don't, the fact you're protecting your borders will be benefited by everyone. So you're safer because of something that you're not paying for, and that's what's called a free ride, or the free rider problem. So if people can benefit from a situation that they're not paying for, you can't exclude them from it. It's very difficult to actually get the money to provide that service. So the market will either become missing, or there'll be no incentive for the firm to actually start producing that good. So when it's like this, when it's non-excludable, non-rival, and non-rejectable, these are public goods that exist. And in the case of like national defence, that's what we call a pure public good. So I'm going to talk about next what a quasi-public good is, as that's slightly different. So quasi-public goods are essentially goods that have characteristics of both private and public goods. So if you think in a market, it's not always as simple as you having a pure public good or a pure private good. Sometimes there'll be things in the middle where there is an incentive function with something like a bridge. So different bridges in different places. Some places you have to pay, where it's easier to monitor and there is profit that can be made for a company. But where there are other bridges where it's more difficult and it might not be profitable, these might have to be provided in the form of a public good. So they might have partial excludability, partial rivalry, and partial rejectability. And that's the idea that there's a quasi-public good, is that there is that middle ground where it's not necessarily a pure public good or a pure private good, somewhere in between. So it's important as well in market failure, and as you will have seen in AS, there's something called externalities, which are essentially the external benefit or cost that is incurred when a transaction takes place. So it's basically by a third party that either gains benefit or costs from the consumption of either merit or demerit goods. And there are two concepts which I want to talk about to do with that. So you have private benefit maximization, social benefit maximization. So private benefit maximization will occur when your marginal private benefit, your MPB, is equated to your marginal private costs. So this is where you're essentially ignoring benefits that might be incurred by others from this transaction. You're just looking at the private benefit and the private cost. So the cost to the person purchasing it and the firm selling that good. However, social benefit maximization is where it's about the welfare of the whole community, not just the one consumer. So that occurs when the social benefit, the marginal social benefit, is equated to the marginal social cost. And the marginal social benefit can be equated to the marginal private benefit and plus the marginal external benefit. Equally, the marginal social cost can be equated to the marginal private cost and the marginal external cost. So the marginal private cost plus the marginal external cost will be equal to your marginal social cost, and that's what makes up these two terms. So the marginal social cost and the marginal social benefit. So it's your private cost plus that third party costs, or your private benefits plus those external benefits. So firms actually are only interested in this private benefit. Okay, they're only interested in them, the sellers, and the consumer. They're not actually interested in the social welfare of the whole community. And that's where you get into these allocative inefficiencies, where actually you're not looking out for the whole welfare of the system, and your price is then no longer equal to your marginal cost, which is where allocative efficiency occurs. So that's one of the reasons that market failure can occur, because of these externalities. So I now want to look at allocative inefficiency, and this stems from those externalities, in particular negative externalities. Because as we know from our theories of efficiency, our price needs to equal marginal cost when we're allocatively efficient. Okay, so the price you're at, the cost of one additional product needs to equal that price, and then we're allocatively efficient. So if we know that our marginal social cost is greater than our marginal private cost, that means that there's actually an external cost, which is essentially a negative externality. If there's an external cost, there's a negative externality. So if that's the case, we know that the price has to be equal the marginal private cost, but it also has to be equal to the marginal social cost. Sorry, that's meant to be a C. So it has to be equal to the marginal social cost. But if there's an external cost, we know that the marginal social cost is our private cost plus any external cost. So therefore the price will actually be less than the social cost, the marginal social cost, and therefore will be inefficient. So as I've put here, if the price is less than marginal social cost, then allocative inefficiencies exist and the market will fail. And it has failed to take into account the true cost of the products. As private firms, they only are interested in the private benefit and the private costs. They're not interested in this social costs, and that's why market failure can take place.